In the last unit, you saw freeform fillings worked generally in a continuous spiral around a three-dimensional object or within a defined space. In this unit, you'll see some variations on familiar methods for working back and forth. But first, we used a travel mug as a mold in the last demonstration. This time, let's look at how you might use another substrate to help anchor your stitching when you don't want to use a mold. A substrate is an underlying material used to support other materials and often to help provide some contrast to show off an open or lacy structure. I'm quite fond of wool felt for many reasons as a substrate, but one of which is that it's easy to bury tails by burrowing into the thickness of the fabric. But a substrate can be anything from paper to quilted layers of fabric to willow hoops to whatever you can come up with. Looping's structure is so stable you can pick up just about anywhere you can slide your needle under something to anchor a stitch. You can anchor to simple looping or cross-knit looping. You can also anchor to just about any kind of stitching you can work on the surface, including plain running stitch. So let's look at some additional anchor options you can use when working with substrates. You may remember seeing blanket stitch used in the cross-knit looping e-course. If not, no worries. Blanket stitch embroidery is basically the same structure as looping. The difference is that instead of inserting the needle into a lag or some other live edge, you make a small stitch into the fabric. Half the stitch is hidden on the back of the fabric. The other half of the stitch and the lag show on the front of the fabric. Those two elements on the front give you very nice places to anchor to. On this piece, I worked a second line of blanket stitch with the lags facing the opposite direction from the first line of blanket stitch. When you sample blanket stitch, try holding the work different ways. You may find it most comfortable when working on an edge to work at the top of the piece with the needle moving from south to north, but try holding it north to south as well. When you're sampling, try advancing first in one direction, then the opposite way, and when you're not working at an edge, you may need to adjust the way you hold things. Another anchor option that should feel familiar is chain stitch embroidery. Basically, it's the same as the detached needle chains we use in looping to begin oval bases, flat panels, and lots of ways in freeform, except that in chain stitch embroidery, the needle passes through the substrate and part of the chain is hidden on the back. Again, when you sample chain stitch embroidery, try different orientations. I find that my links are more consistent in size when I work from south to north, throwing the thread so the needle passes over it. Your mileage may vary. Now I can hear you thinking, I thought we didn't want consistency in freeform. For anchors, you may or may not. You'll have a better idea what works in a particular situation after sampling with a particular substrate and thread combination. For this demonstration, I stitched two pieces of wool felt together using blanket stitch to use as a substrate and to create anchor points around the perimeter. Then I added a row of blanket stitch embroidery on the front, and then another row with the lags facing the opposite direction. With those rows of blanket stitch on the front, the blanket stitch on the edge, some chain stitch embroidery, and even a little running stitch, I had plenty of anchor points for the filling. Use the lags of the blanket stitch or links of a chain stitch, or really anything that's available, as a live edge. Loop across that live edge. At the end, pass the working thread under an anchor point and work back across. You may want to rotate the piece 180 degrees and change your needle orientation for the trip back. As always, sample different ways of holding things to see what's best for you. You can also use cross knit looping, working back and forth. In either case, find a way to anchor the thread before changing direction. You may recall that in simple looping, just working back along a live edge with the same orientation results in a change in the way threads cross in the stitches of alternate rows, and that can buckle the fabric. In New Age Looping Basics, we used flip turns for working back and forth to produce a smooth, regular surface. In Freeform, though, you can get away with that buckle and even use it as a design feature, which we'll explore in Lesson 3. But for now, there's another option for working back and forth in simple looping. We'll call it a thread return. After stitching across the live edge in the direction you normally stitch, anchor the thread and return it back along the lags of the row just stitched. Then anchor it again on that end where you want to begin your next row. On this row, trap the return thread as you stitch. Insert the needle under a lag and under the return thread before passing over the working thread. Another return option is to whip the thread back over the lags of the row just stitched. That works really well with fine threads, very open structures, or in situations where you might want to have some skips or very large lags in your next forward row. Returns, whether they're plain or corded, produce a less elastic structure and more visual weight than simply working back and forth. So you won't use them in every situation, but when you do choose to use them, they make it possible for you to do most of your stitching in your preferred orientation, one that lets you manage the needle with your dominant hand and use your non-dominant hand effectively for thread control. Let me note here that I'm right-handed, and generally my preferred orientation is stitching from left to right with the needle moving from north to south. That doesn't make this right or righter than any other orientation. Every stitcher is different. Returns are also great places to trap tails when you end, add, or change thread. Keep in mind that you don't have to work in straight lines from edge to edge across a whole area. Anywhere you can anchor a thread, you can turn. Whether you're working in the round or back and forth, remember to change things up frequently as you work in Freeform. That may mean changing colors before a thread runs out, or altering the size of stitches and lags to make some areas more dense and others more open and lacy, or so that the substrate shows through. In the next video, I'll show you a technique for joining edges that's really quite useful when you want to cinch out the slack in a piece. I'll see you there.